The orphaned boy took shelter in a fisherman's cabin and saw something in the water he was never meant to see. Tell us in the comments which state you're watching from. Hit the like button and let's begin. Ethan was 12 years old when he ran away from the Riverside Children's Home for the third and final time. But this time, he wasn't running toward anything. He was running back to the only place that had ever felt like home, even though that place no longer existed the way he remembered it. 3 years earlier, his parents had disappeared during a storm off the coast of northern Maine. His father, Daniel Reed, had been a commercial fisherman his entire adult life, working the cold Atlantic waters where the continental shelf dropped into darkness. His mother, Sarah, had worked at the town's only marine supply shop, spending her evenings mending nets by lamplight while Ethan did homework at the kitchen table. They lived in a small coastal village called Bishop's Point, population 217, where everyone knew everyone and the ocean dictated the rhythm of life. Ethan had grown up with salt air in his lungs and the sound of waves as his lullaby. His childhood was measured in tides, in the smell of drying fish, in his father's calloused hands teaching him how to tie proper knots. The night his parents disappeared, the storm had come without warning. No weather service had predicted it. No fisherman had seen the signs. The sky had simply turned black at 4 in the afternoon, and the ocean had risen like something alive and furious. Daniel had been out on his boat, the Storm Chaser, along with 6 other vessels from Bishop's Point. When the storm hit, all communication went dead. For 3 days, the Coast Guard searched. They found wreckage. They found debris. They found one overturned hull with no bodies inside. They never found Daniel Reed or any of the other fishermen. The official report called it a freak weather event, a microburst storm system that had formed over unusually warm water and dissipated just as quickly. But Ethan had heard the other fishermen talking in low voices at his father's memorial service. He had heard words that didn't make sense to a 9-year-old boy. Deep water. The drop-off. Something they woke up. With no living relatives and no one in Bishop's Point able to take in another child, Ethan was transferred to state custody and placed at Riverside Children's Home, 200 miles inland in a town that smelled like car exhaust and had no horizon. The next 3 years were the loneliest of his life. Riverside wasn't an abusive institution, at least not in obvious ways. The director, Mr. Vernon Hayes, was a thin man in his 50s who smiled with his mouth but never his eyes. He ran the facility with cold efficiency, treating the children like inventory to be managed rather than human beings to be cared for. The food was adequate but tasteless. The dormitories were clean but crowded. The rules were strict and arbitrary. Lights out at 8. No personal belongings beyond one small box per child. No complaints. But what broke Ethan wasn't the harsh conditions. It was the erasure of identity. At Riverside, he was no longer Ethan Reed, son of Daniel and Sarah, boy who knew every tide pool on the northern coast. He was bed 14. Case number R2847. A problem to be processed. He had tried to run away twice before. The first time, he made it 30 miles before being picked up by state police at a bus station. The second time, he lasted 4 days living in an abandoned warehouse before hunger drove him to steal food from a grocery store, and the security cameras led authorities straight back to him. Each time, Mr. Hayes had delivered the same speech in his office, a wood-paneled room that smelled like old cigars and institutional disinfectant. Ethan, running away solves nothing. You have no family. You have no resources. The state provides you with shelter, food, and education. When you turn 18, you'll be released with vocational training and a modest stipend. Until then, you will follow the rules. But Mr. Hayes had left out one crucial detail, something Ethan had only discovered 2 weeks earlier when he overheard a phone conversation through the director's half-open office door. Hayes was selling children. Not openly, not violently, but through a network of legal loopholes and falsified documents. He was facilitating adoptions and placements that came with substantial cash payments from families who were never properly vetted. Some of the children ended up in legitimate homes. Others vanished into situations that were never investigated. Ethan had heard his own name mentioned during that phone call. The Reed boy is 12 now. Healthy. No behavioral issues beyond the escape attempts. The client is offering $15,000 for a clean transfer. Documentation will be ready by the end of the month. That night, Ethan made his decision. He wasn't going to wait to be sold. He wasn't going to spend 6 more years in a system that treated him like livestock. He was going home. He left at 3 in the morning. Slipping out through a bathroom window, he had been slowly loosening for weeks. He had saved $73 from odd jobs and had stolen a road map from the facility's library. He knew exactly where he was going. His father's fishing cabin. Daniel Reed had built the cabin himself over the course of 5 years, starting when Ethan was 4. It sat on a rocky promontory 3 miles north of Bishop's Point, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through dense pine forest and over slick granite ledges. The cabin was small, just one main room with a sleeping loft, a wood stove, and a covered porch that looked out over the Atlantic. His father had used it during the summer months when fishing was best, staying there for days at a time when the catch was good and the weather held. Ethan and his mother would visit on weekends, bringing supplies and spending evenings watching the sun set over water that stretched to infinity. It was the last place Ethan had felt truly safe. And even though he knew it had probably been abandoned for 3 years, even though it might be falling apart or occupied by someone else, it was the only destination that made sense. The journey took him 4 days. He hitchhiked when he could, hiding in the backs of trucks when drivers wouldn't stop. He walked miles along highway shoulders, keeping his head down whenever police cars passed. He slept in rest stop bathrooms and ate whatever he could afford from vending machines and gas stations. By the time he reached the Maine coast, he was exhausted, filthy, and running on pure determination. Bishop's Point looked exactly as he remembered and completely different at the same time. The houses were the same. The docks were the same. But there was a hollowness to the place now, as if something vital had been drained from it. He saw fewer boats in the harbor, fewer people on the streets. Several storefronts had been boarded up. He didn't stop in town. He couldn't risk being recognized and reported back to Riverside. Instead, he skirted the edge of the village and headed north along the coastal trail he knew by heart. The forest had grown wilder in 3 years. Branches scratched at his face. Roots threatened to trip him with every step. But muscle memory guided him forward, and when he finally emerged from the trees onto the rocky promontory, his breath caught in his throat. The cabin was still there. It looked worse than he had imagined. Shingles had blown off the roof. One of the porch supports had rotted through. The windows were fogged with salt residue and moisture. But the structure was intact. Ethan approached slowly, almost afraid that getting too close would make it vanish like a dream. When he reached the front door, he found it secured with a simple padlock, rusted but still functional. He found a rock and smashed the lock off. The door swung open with a prolonged creak, releasing air that smelled of mildew, old wood, and something else. Something oceanic and ancient. Ethan stepped inside. The main room was smaller than he remembered, the way childhood places always shrink with time. But everything was still there. His father's workbench along the far wall, the wood stove in the corner, the small table where they used to eat meals. Even the old oil lamp still hung from its hook near the door. 3 years of dampness had taken its toll. Mold grew in dark patches on the walls. The floorboards were warped and soft in places. The sleeping loft ladder had partially collapsed. But it was shelter. It was his. Ethan dropped his backpack and walked slowly through the space, touching things his father had touched. Tools still hung on pegs. A coffee mug sat on the windowsill, a brown ring still visible at the bottom. In the corner, he found a wooden chest containing old blankets, fishing line, hooks, and an emergency supply kit that included waterproof matches, a first aid kit, and 3 cans of beans that hadn't yet expired. As he explored, he began to notice things he had been too young to pay attention to before. Strange marks on the walls. Not random scratches, but deliberate carvings. Symbols that looked almost like letters, but weren't from any alphabet he recognized. They were concentrated near the window that faced the ocean, carved directly into the wooden window frame. He found more symbols on the underside of the table, more on the ceiling beams. And then he found the journal. It was hidden beneath a loose floorboard near the wood stove, wrapped in oiled canvas to protect it from moisture. The moment Ethan pulled it out and unwrapped it, he recognized his father's handwriting on the cover. Daniel Reed. Personal log. Private. Ethan's hands trembled as he opened it. The first entry was dated 7 years earlier, 2 years before Ethan was born. August 14th. Saw something in the deep water today beyond the shelf. Couldn't make out details, but it was massive. Bigger than any whale. Moved wrong. Old Tom says we don't talk about what's out there. Says his grandfather made him promise never to fish past the drop-off. Says there are rules that go back generations. I think he's serious. Ethan turned the pages, reading entry after entry. His father's writing became more urgent as the dates progressed. September 3rd. 3 boats went out past the boundary markers last week. Only one came back. Coast Guard says it was equipment failure. But Jimmy Corcoran was on that boat, and he won't talk about what he saw. His hands shake now. He quit fishing. October 12th. The symbols I've been carving are from Sarah's grandmother. She was Meekmack, knew the old stories about the guardian of the deep. She said the symbols are protection, recognition, a way of saying we know it's there and we respect the boundary. November 20th. Industrial trawlers are moving into our waters. Big corporate operations. They're using sonar that goes deeper than anything we've ever used. I don't think they know what they're doing. I don't think they care. Ethan kept reading as daylight faded and shadows filled the cabin. He lit the oil lamp with one of the waterproof matches, the flame casting dancing shapes on the walls. The journal entries grew darker. March 8th. 5 vessels disappeared last night. No storm. No warning. Just gone. The water was calm. Coast Guard found debris this morning. The metal was bent inward, like something had crushed the boats from below. April 2nd. I'm taking the storm chaser out tomorrow with volunteers. We're going to try to mark the boundary more clearly, put up warning buoys past the drop-off. Maybe if we show respect, if we acknowledge what's out there, it will understand we're not part of the problem. The next entry was dated April 3rd, the day his father disappeared. Going out at dawn. Sarah doesn't want me to go. I can see the fear in her eyes. But if we don't try to stop what's happening, if we don't try to restore the balance, I don't think any of us will be safe. The old ones say the Leviathan sleeps in the deepest water, and when it wakes, the ocean itself wakes with it. I think it's waking. I think we woke it. If I don't come back, someone needs to finish this. Someone needs to remember. That was the last entry. Ethan sat on the floor, holding the journal against his chest, tears streaming down his face for the first time since his parents' memorial service. His father hadn't died in a random storm. He had gone out deliberately, trying to protect something, trying to fix something. And now Ethan understood why the town felt hollow, why there were fewer boats, why people spoke in whispers. They knew. They had always known. And they were terrified. Outside, night had fully fallen. The ocean was invisible beyond the window, but Ethan could hear it. Waves crashing against rocks, wind pushing through the pine trees. And beneath that, something else. A sound so low it was almost below the threshold of hearing. A vibration more than a sound. Rhythmic. Patient. Like breathing. Ethan stood and walked to the window. He pressed his face against the cold glass, trying to see anything in the darkness. At first, there was nothing but black. Ocean and sky merged into a void. But then, far out beyond where the breakers formed, he saw a faint glow. Bioluminescence, he thought at first. Plankton disturbed by fish. But the glow was too large, too deliberate. It moved in a way that suggested intelligence rather than random current. And it was rising. Ethan watched, transfixed, as the glow grew brighter and closer. It wasn't coming toward shore. It was ascending from depth, from a place where sunlight had never reached. The rhythmic vibration grew stronger. It resonated through the floorboards, through his bones. And then he saw it. Not clearly, Not completely, but enough. A shape so massive it defied comprehension. Something that existed at a scale between animal and geography. The bioluminescent glow came from patterns along its body, markings that looked almost like the symbols his father had carved into the cabin. And then the shape rolled, breaking the surface just enough for Ethan to see what nightmares are made of. An eye, larger than the cabin he was standing in, luminous, ancient, aware. It looked directly at the cabin, directly at the window, directly at him. Ethan couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't look away. The eye regarded him for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. And then slowly, deliberately, it closed. The massive shape descended. The glow faded. The ocean returned to darkness. But Ethan understood something in that moment that his father had understood. That generations of fishermen had understood. The ocean was not empty. It was not indifferent. It was watched over, protected. And humanity had broken an agreement they had forgotten they'd made. He stood at the window for hours, waiting to see if the shape would return. It didn't. Eventually, exhaustion overwhelmed fear, and he collapsed onto one of the old blankets, still clutching his father's journal. He woke to gray morning light and the sound of voices outside. Ethan bolted upright, his heart hammering. Through the dirty window, he could see 3 men standing near the tree line, looking toward the cabin. One of them was pointing. He recognized none of them, but their body language was clear. They were searching, and they had found what they were looking for. Ethan grabbed his backpack and the journal, moving quickly to the back of the cabin where a small window faced the cliff edge. He forced it open, wincing at the scraping sound, and squeezed through just as he heard footsteps on the porch. He's definitely here. Fresh tracks. That padlock was broken recently. Ethan didn't wait to hear more. He dropped from a window and ran along the cliff edge, keeping low. The trail back to town was blocked, but there was another path, one his father had shown him once. A narrow route that led down to a small cove where they used to collect mussels. The descent was treacherous. Loose rocks, slick surfaces, drops that would be fatal if he slipped. But fear made him agile. And within minutes, he had reached a small beach hidden between towering rock walls. The cove was accessible only at low tide, and Ethan had maybe 2 hours before the water would rise and trap him there. He needed to move, but he also needed to think. Who were those men? How had they found him so quickly? Were they from Riverside? Or were they something else? He pulled out his father's journal and flipped to the later entries, looking for answers. One passage caught his attention. May 15th. The corporate fishing operation is called Oceanic Harvest Solutions. They're not just fishing. I've seen their boats deploying equipment that looks more like military hardware than fishing gear. Jamie's cousin works for the Coast Guard and says there have been classified complaints about them. Says they're being protected from above. Says money is changing hands. Ethan's blood went cold. If his father had been investigating a corporate operation, if he had been trying to stop them, then his disappearance might not have been the Leviathan's fault at all. It might have been murder. And if those men outside the cabin were connected to Oceanic Harvest Solutions, they weren't here to return him to an orphanage. They were here to silence him before he figured out what his father had discovered. He was about to keep reading when he heard a sound that made him freeze. Voices coming from above. The men had tracked him to the cliff edge and were beginning the descent. Down there, I see footprints in the sand. Ethan looked around frantically. The cove was a dead end. The cliff walls were too steep to climb. The tide was coming in, and within an hour the water would be too deep to wade through. He was trapped. Unless, at the far end of the cove, barely visible between 2 rock formations, was a narrow opening. He had never been inside it. His father had told him it was dangerous, that it flooded completely at high tide, that the currents inside could pull a person under. But it was the only option. Ethan ran across the beach and squeezed into the opening just as the first man reached the bottom of the cliff. There, he went into the cave. The opening led to a tunnel, naturally formed by centuries of wave action. The walls were slick with algae. The floor was covered in tide pools and loose stones. Ethan moved as quickly as he dared, using his hands to steady himself against the walls. Behind him, he could hear splashing. The men were following. The tunnel curved sharply to the right, and suddenly Ethan was standing in a larger chamber. Daylight filtered in from a crack in the ceiling high above, illuminating a space that took his breath away. The walls were covered in carvings. Not recent ones, ancient ones. Symbols similar to those his father had carved in the cabin, but these were weathered by centuries. They covered every available surface, telling a story in a language Ethan couldn't read, but somehow understood. Images of boats, images of fishermen, images of an enormous creature rising from the depths, images of offerings being made, agreements being honored. This was a sacred place. A place where the people who lived here long before Europeans arrived had communicated with something they considered both dangerous and necessary. But Ethan didn't have time to study the carvings. The splashing behind him was getting closer. He looked around desperately and saw that the chamber had two exits. The tunnel he had entered through, and another opening on the opposite side that led further into darkness. He chose darkness. The second tunnel was narrower and descended steeply. Ethan had to crouch, then crawl. The sound of the ocean grew louder, echoing in strange ways that made it seem like he was surrounded by water. And then the tunnel opened up. Ethan emerged onto a ledge overlooking a massive underground chamber, partially filled with seawater that surged and retreated with the tide. The space was enormous, cathedral-like, with stalactites hanging from a ceiling he could barely make out in the dim light filtering through cracks far above. But what made Ethan's breath catch wasn't the size of the chamber. It was what was in the water. Bones. Massive bones. Arranged deliberately. Whale ribs formed archways. Vertebrae the size of car tires were stacked in patterns. And in the center of it all, surrounded by carefully placed stones, was a skull unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. It was as long as a school bus. The jaw was filled with teeth that curved inward like knives. The eye sockets were the size of windows. This was not a natural formation. This was a shrine, a burial site, a memorial to something that had once lived and died here, or something that still lived and was being honored. Ethan heard voices echoing from the tunnel behind him. The men were close. "This is insane. We need to call the boss. Just find the kid. Hayes wants him delivered, not reported." Hayes. Mr. Vernon Hayes. The director of Riverside Children's Home. So that's who these men were. Not corporate security. Not fishermen. They were bounty hunters, paid by Hayes to retrieve escaped children and make sure no one asked too many questions. But why was Hayes so desperate to get Ethan back? Why send 3 men all the way to Maine? The answer clicked into place. The phone conversation Ethan had overheard. The client offering $15,000. It wasn't a random adoption. Someone specifically wanted Ethan Reed. Someone who knew who his father was. Someone who wanted to make sure Daniel Reed's son couldn't continue whatever investigation his father had started. Oceanic Harvest Solutions. Ethan's father had been killed for trying to protect the Leviathan. And now they wanted to ensure his son couldn't expose what had really happened. The voices were right behind him now. Ethan looked down at the water, surging through the chamber below. It was too far to jump safely. The current was too strong. He would be smashed against the rocks or swept out to sea. But he was out of options. He was about to jump when the water in the chamber suddenly went still. Completely, unnaturally still. The surging stopped. The sound of waves vanished, and something rose from the center of the pool. At first, Ethan thought it was a rock, or a piece of wreckage. But then it kept rising, and rising. It was a head, not the massive shape he had seen from a cabin, but something connected to it. A smaller appendage, a limb, something that could fit into this underground space. The bioluminescent patterns his father had described glowed faintly along its surface. And as it broke the water fully, Ethan saw that it wasn't grotesque or monstrous in the way he had imagined. It was ancient, patient, intelligent. The appendage, or whatever it was moved with deliberate grace. It approached the bone shrine in the center of the chamber and seemed to regard it with something like reverence. And then it turned toward the ledge where Ethan was standing. Behind him, flashlight beams cut through the darkness of the tunnel. The men had almost reached him. The creature's appendage rose higher, and Ethan saw what looked like an eye, small compared to the massive one he had seen from the cabin, but still larger than his entire body. It regarded him with the same ancient awareness. And then it did something Ethan would never be able to explain to anyone. It moved aside, deliberately, creating a path through the water, showing him an exit. Ethan didn't hesitate. He jumped. The water was shockingly cold, but the current that should have pulled him under did no such thing. Instead, he felt himself being guided, pushed gently toward a tunnel he hadn't seen before, partially submerged but large enough to swim through. Behind him, he heard shouts of confusion and fear as the men emerged onto the ledge and saw what was in the chamber. "What the hell is that? Get back! Get back!" But the creature wasn't interested in them. It had already submerged again, leaving only ripples. Ethan swam through the tunnel, his lungs burning, until he saw light ahead. He kicked hard and burst through the surface, gasping, finding himself in open water just beyond the cove. The tide was coming in fast now, and the current pulled him away from the rocks. He swam parallel to shore until he was far enough from the cave system that the men wouldn't be able to follow, then let the waves push him onto a narrow strip of beach. He collapsed on the sand, coughing up seawater, still clutching his father's journal, which he had somehow managed to keep pressed against his chest during the swim. When he could finally breathe normally again, he sat up and looked out at the ocean. The water was dark and choppy, giving no indication of what lived beneath its surface. But Ethan knew now. He had seen it, touched it in a way, and it had let him live. More than that, it had saved him. Why? He opened the journal to the last page his father had written, reading the words again with new understanding. "If I don't come back, someone needs to finish this. Someone needs to remember." Ethan looked down at his hands, still shaking from cold and adrenaline. He was 12 years old. He was alone. He was being hunted by people who wanted to erase his father's legacy. But he had something they didn't. He had the truth. He had proof. He had his father's research. And he had been chosen by something ancient to carry a message forward. The Leviathan hadn't killed his father. It had been trying to protect him, the same way it had just protected Ethan. His father had died because corporate greed and human arrogance had broken an ancient agreement. They had pushed into waters they had no right to be in, disturbed something that should have been left alone. And now it was waking up, defending itself, defending its territory. Ethan stood on shaking legs and looked toward the tree line. He couldn't go back to the cabin. He couldn't go into town. But he couldn't keep running forever either. He needed help. Real help. Someone who would believe him. Someone who had the power to stop Oceanic Harvest Solutions and expose what they had done. He thought about his father's journal entries mentioning Jamie's cousin who worked for the Coast Guard. Someone who had tried to file complaints about the corporate fishing operation. Someone who had been silenced. Maybe that person would listen to the son of Daniel Reed. Maybe that person would want justice as much as Ethan did. He started walking north along the beach, keeping to the shadows, moving with purpose now rather than panic. The journal was waterlogged but still readable. The evidence was intact. And somewhere in the deep water offshore, something ancient was waiting to see what humanity would do next. Whether they would learn, whether they would remember, whether they would restore the balance they had broken. Ethan didn't know if he could change anything. He didn't know if anyone would believe a 12-year-old orphan with a fantastic story about a sea monster and corporate conspiracy. But he knew he had to try, because his father had tried, and because something that had lived in the ocean for thousands of years had looked at him and seen someone worth saving. He would not waste that gift. 3 days later, Ethan stood outside the regional Coast Guard station in Portland, Maine. He had walked, hitchhiked, and hidden his way down the coast, surviving on food stolen from dumpsters and water from public fountains. He was filthy, exhausted, and terrified. But he was here. He pushed through the front door and approached the desk where a uniformed woman in her 30s was reviewing paperwork. She looked up, taking in his appearance with trained concern. "Son, are you all right? Are you lost?" Ethan placed his father's journal on the desk. "My name is Ethan Reed. My father was Daniel Reed. He was murdered 3 years ago by people trying to hide what they found in the deep water off Bishop's Point. I have proof. And I need to talk to someone who actually cares about the truth." The woman stared at him for a long moment. Then she picked up a phone. "I need Lieutenant Morrison down here immediately. Tell her it's about the Reed case." Ethan felt something release in his chest. The Reed case. They knew. They remembered. Maybe he wasn't alone after all. Within 20 minutes, he was sitting in a private conference room with Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, a woman in her 40s with gray-streaked hair and eyes that had seen too much bureaucratic corruption. She listened without interrupting as Ethan told her everything. She read every page of the journal. She looked at the photos Ethan had managed to take with a disposable camera he had found in the cabin, showing the symbols, the bone shrine, even one blurry image of bioluminescent glow in dark water. When he finished, she sat back and let out a long breath. "Your father contacted me 4 years ago," she said quietly. He was trying to document illegal fishing practices and environmental violations by Oceanic Harvest Solutions. He had evidence of illegal sonar use, dynamite fishing, violation of protected zones. I tried to help him build a case, but every time we got close, the investigation would be shut down from above. She paused, her jaw tightening. When he disappeared, I was told to drop it. That it was a tragic accident. That pursuing conspiracy theories would damage my career. But I never believed it. And I've been waiting 3 years for someone to give me a reason to reopen the investigation. She looked at Ethan with something between sadness and determination. You just gave me that reason. What followed was a year of legal battles, federal investigations, and media attention that Ethan was completely unprepared for. Lieutenant Morrison became his unofficial guardian while the court sorted out his custody status. She protected him from reporters, from Oceanic Harvest Solutions lawyers, and from Mr. Vernon Hayes, who was arrested 6 months into the investigation when his child trafficking operation was finally exposed. The evidence in Daniel Reed's journal, combined with Lieutenant Morrison's previous research and new testimony from other fishermen who had been afraid to speak out, built a case that was impossible to ignore. Oceanic Harvest Solutions was shut down. 3 executives were arrested for environmental crimes, manslaughter, and conspiracy to commit murder. The company had known that their deep water operations were causing ecological damage. They had known that fishermen were dying because of disturbances in the ocean's natural patterns. And they had actively worked to silence anyone who tried to stop them. But the part of the story that fascinated the public most was the part Ethan couldn't prove. The Leviathan itself. Scientists, marine biologists, and cryptozoologists all weighed in. Some dismissed it as trauma-induced hallucination. Others suggested he had seen a blue whale or basking shark and misinterpreted it in the darkness. A few took him seriously, pointing to the centuries of indigenous stories about great guardians in the deep, stories that predated European contact and were remarkably consistent across different cultures. One marine biologist, Dr. Patricia Chen, met with Ethan privately and told him something he would never forget. "The ocean is the least explored place on Earth," she said. "We've mapped more of the moon's surface than our own ocean floor. We discover new species every year, some of them massive. Is it possible there's something down there we don't know about? Something that's been there longer than human civilization? Absolutely. But more importantly, whether the Leviathan is literal or symbolic doesn't matter as much as the message." She leaned forward, her expression serious. For thousands of years, humans understood that the ocean was sacred, that there were boundaries that shouldn't be crossed, that taking too much, pushing too deep, disrupting the balance would have consequences. We forgot that. We treated the ocean like an infinite resource to be exploited. And now we're seeing those consequences in overfishing, dead zones, ecosystem collapse. Your father understood that. He died trying to restore that respect. And you're continuing his work. Ethan was placed in foster care with Lieutenant Morrison, who officially adopted him on his 14th birthday. He finished high school with honors and was accepted to college on a full scholarship, studying marine biology and environmental law. But he never forgot what he had seen, what he had felt, the ancient awareness in that enormous eye, the deliberate choice to save him rather than destroy him. On the 10th anniversary of his father's death, Ethan returned to Bishop's Point for the first time since the investigation. The town had recovered somewhat. New boats worked the harbor, but they all respected the boundaries now. No one fished past the drop-off. No one used destructive methods. And on the anniversary of the storm that had killed the 7 fishermen, the entire town gathered to place wreaths in the water and remember. Ethan attended the memorial, standing beside Lieutenant Morrison, who had become the mother he needed. When it was his turn to speak, he walked to the end of the dock and looked out at the dark water. "My father taught me that the ocean is not empty," he said, his voice carrying over the quiet crowd. "It's not a void. It's not a resource. It's alive. It's ancient. It's sacred. And it deserves our respect." He placed his wreath in the water and watched it drift out toward deeper water, toward the drop-off where light faded into mystery. The things we can't see are often the most important to protect, not because we understand them, but because we don't. Because there are forces in the world older and wiser than humanity, and our job is not to conquer them. It's to learn to live alongside them. That night, he returned to his father's cabin, which had been restored and now served as a research station for marine conservation efforts. He stood on the porch where he had first seen the Leviathan rise from the depths, and he looked out at the moonlit water. For a long time, there was nothing but waves and stars. And then, far beyond the breakers, in the deep water where the continental shelf dropped away into abyssal darkness, he saw a faint glow. Bioluminescent patterns moving just beneath the surface. Not threatening, not approaching, just there, watching, waiting, remembering. Ethan raised one hand in silent acknowledgement. The glow pulsed once, twice, and then faded back into the depths. The agreement had been restored. The boundary was recognized again. And the ancient guardian of the deep had returned to its sleep, knowing that at least some humans still remember their place in the larger order of things. Ethan went inside, sat at his father's old desk, and opened a new journal. On the first page, he wrote, "This is the story my father couldn't finish. The story of the Leviathan. The story of the boundary. The story of what happens when we forget that we are not the only intelligent life on this planet, and that some things must be protected not from nature, but from us." He would spend the rest of his life telling that story. In his work, in his research, in the laws he would help pass, and the policies he would help shape. But more than that, he would live it. Every day, every choice, every moment standing at the edge of the water, looking out at mysteries he would never fully understand, but would always defend. Because his father had died for that truth. And because something ancient had looked at a frightened child and chosen compassion over destruction. That was a debt Ethan would spend his entire life repaying. Not to the Leviathan, to the ocean itself, to the balance, to the future. Some things, once seen, can never be unseen. Some truths, once learned, can never be forgotten. And some promises, once made, must be kept forever.